What is up, everybody? This is JP, your online personal trainer. Last week's video, I did a video on training to failure and how it's affecting your gains negatively. Definitely check that out if you haven't watched it already, but I said that I would do my next video on when it's okay to train to failure, which is this video. Again, like I said before, training to failure is pretty, it's an attractive way to train, and some people say you have to train to failure to see gains. Again, I think it's the least popular opinion to say that you don't have to. That's not a very popular opinion. And I explained why, for the most part, you shouldn't train to failure in my last video. But today I'm going to go over 4 main reasons why, or when you can train to failure and how it won't affect your gains. The first one is the last set of an exercise. Typically, when you do a workout, you have a certain amount of exercises and you do multiple sets of that exercise. Whether it be leg day, you have back squats, or whether it be an upper body day, or if you do like the body part splits and you have a chest day, you do multiple sets of an exercise. Again, I think the example I used in my last video was back squats. We'll use bench press this time. Okay, let's just say your first exercise is bench press and you're doing 4 sets of bench press. While I did say in my last video, I don't think it's good to go to failure on every single set. If you're gonna go to failure, I recommend you do it on your last set of that exercise. Why is this okay to do it this way? Well, typically, I guess it wouldn't really affect it this way if you're doing body part splits, but even if you're, let's just say in the worst case scenario, let's just say you're doing a body part split where you have all your push muscles on one day. Let's just say you're doing chest, shoulders, and a triceps workout like that, and you're doing bench press first. If you go to failure on your 4th set, even though your next exercise is going to be another push exercise, it still isn't going to be the exact same push exercise. Let's just say you go from a bench press to dips, or you go from a bench press to an overhead press. Even though you took the bench press to failure, yes, it will fatigue you a little bit in your next exercise because it's using the same muscle group. It's not going to affect it as much because it's still not the exact same exercise. Just because you fatigued yourself, you went to failure on the last set of a bench press, doesn't necessarily mean that an overhead press is going to be as effective as if you had another set of bench press instead. So if you had 5 sets of bench press and you went to failure on the 4th set, your 5th set's going to be affected pretty badly. Now, I'm not saying that an overhead press isn't going to get affected from a previous set of a bench press going to failure. It will, but not to the same extent as if you did a bench press. Now, a better way that this can be implemented is if you have if you do all your upper body on one day, which I personally prefer, because it lets you manage volume a little bit more appropriately, lets you have a higher frequency. Typically when you have upper body day, you'll do like either a pulling exercise 3 to 4 sets, and then you go to a pushing exercise 3 to 4 sets. If you have your workout set up this way, it's a lot better to go to failure on your last set this way, because, for example, let's just say your first exercise is bench press. You take your last set, your 4th set, to failure, and then you go into, let's just say, a bench over row next. That bench over row is not going to be affected, maybe a very minute amount, because there is global fatigue, but a very minute amount. Me, I can't feel it at all. My volume's not affected at all when I switch from a pushing to a pulling. And then after your bent over row, if you go back to a pushing exercise, which you should, like a overhead press or dips, because you had that 3 to 4 sets of a pulling exercise as rest for those pushing muscle groups, to me it affects volume in almost no way for my next exercise. But because you took this last set to failure, let's just say you were to stop at 8 reps because you're not trying to take your last set to failure, but let's just say you actually did go to failure and you did 11 reps of a bench press. When you come to your next exercise, you're not going to really be fatigued because you had that bench over row break on your pushing muscle groups, which all that means to me is that you just did an extra 3 reps on that bench press, which is more volume. So you're not affecting your volume. If anything, you're increasing it. So if you have like an upper body day where you alternate pushing, pulling exercises, the last set is that's probably a good time to go to failure. Now remember, you don't have to. Again, there are still those other possible things that can happen if you train to failure regularly, like I explained in my last video. Like, even though you might be increasing volume, if you're doing the last set of every exercise training to failure, that could potentially lead to injury, especially on a compound movement. Again, that's something that if you have proper form and you're only doing it on the last set, and then you do other things that you're supposed to, train your rotator cuff, you probably won't have any injury. But most people aren't perfect with their training plans. So again, if you know your training program's good, you got good overall muscular balance, you don't have jacked up shoulders, you train your rotator cuff, you're basically a very healthy individual, then taking the last set to failure would be definitely a good option. Now, the next instance you would train to failure would be during high repetition sets. If you're training for high repetitions, whatever you want to call it, metabolic fatigue, whatever name you want to slap on there. Basically, if you're training to higher reps, I recommend you get close to failure or go to failure. And I honestly recommend that. I don't recommend training, unless you're doing some type of physical therapy or rehabilitation, I don't recommend training to failure, or not training to failure on repetitions that are high. Because right here I wrote down lightweight not to failure basically means low gains or no gains at all. If you look at the scientific literature, there are when it comes to weight and reps, you can gain muscle two ways: with moderately heavy or heavy weights, not to failure or to failure. But either way, not to failure from moderately heavy and heavy weights will help you gain muscle to a good extent, optimal gains. But with the second you start going like 20 reps or higher, if you don't train to failure, if you train at like sub-maximal RPEs, you're going to be hurting your gains. You're basically going to not be gaining much at all. So if you're going high repetitions, I really recommend you get really close to failure, or you just go to failure. Again, there are certain circumstances where high reps, I still wouldn't go to failure, but then I wouldn't do high reps at all in that instance, So I would definitely keep that in mind. If you're training high reps and you're not going to failure, those are probably basically wasted sets. The third way I recommend you train to failure is if you have like a blocked periodized program, like you have a period of time where you're training for one specific goal, and then another time where you're training for another specific goal. Like, for example, during a block periodized program that I'm doing right now, I have a volume block, and then I have an intensification block, a very basic block setup. During intensity blocks, that's a good time to train to failure on certain movements. Not every movement. I still wouldn't recommend training to failure on like every set on a back squat or anything. But like during isolation movements, honestly, even every single set during isolation movements, if you wanted to, if you set your program up that way, it would be okay to train to failure. Well, why? You may be thinking, well, you just talked about only doing it on the last set. Or in the last video, you may be thinking you just talked about training to failure and every set hurts volume. It does. But if you're doing this during an intensity block, your goal is not to increase volume over time. Your goal is to increase intensity, whether that be intensity of a percentage of 1 rep max to train heavier, or for movements that don't really gain or benefit from going heavy in a percentage of 1 rep max, you could train intensity of effort, which would be an RPE. So let me give you an example. Dumbbell lateral raises. Those are an exercise. I don't care how strong you are, if you're a strongman or a bodybuilder, for your own relative strength, you're not going to be lifting really heavy on lateral raises. You're not. And I wouldn't see strongman or someone else doing lateral raises anyways. But for gaining muscle, bodybuilding, or even strength during like an intensity block, isolation movements, they're hard to overload with heavy weight. So if you can't overload them with a percentage of 1 rep max, you can overload them with an intensity of effort, which means training closer to failure. So to put it in a sentence, instead of increasing weight during an intensification block for isolation movements, you could just increase RPE, which is training closer to failure or going to failure. Because again, your goal is not hypertrophy or to gain volume during this period of training. But again, during a volume block, I would not train to failure on every single set, even of isolation movements. I would probably use this over here, just the last set, train to failure. And the last one, which is again may not be as scientific, but there is some science to back this up, is just for fun, training for fun. training to failure for fun. And now I'm not saying use this as an excuse to train to failure all the time. That's not what I mean. You can't say, oh, I like training to failure, it's fun, so I'm going to do it all the time. No, it might be fun for a little bit, but trust me, you won't be training for long if you train to failure for fun every single set, every single rep of every single day. I just mean that in some circumstances, a lot of people like getting a pump, or a lot of people like training to failure, and it is an attractive way to train. And while everything I said I do stand by, I don't think it's good to do it every single set. I don't think it's good to do it every workout. If you're training for fun, for, you know, just again for fun, but you're training it because you like doing an exercise to failure, or you get a pump, or you like the way it, some people just like the way it feels, you know. They like feeling, it makes them feel like they're making gains better, even though you might not actually be. It's something that, like I said, it's an attractive way to train for you. So if you're gonna implement this into your training just because you want to, you don't care about what the science necessarily says, you like training to failure just because you like doing it, just be intelligent about it. Like I said, use these 3 ways to implement it into your training, or just don't do it all the time. Maybe you can have a day where it's a little less volume, even during a volume block. Not every day has to be the same volume. If you're doing a volume block, maybe you can have a day during the week where it's still less volume, where you train a little bit harder, or you do less sets. If you do less sets, you can train closer to failure. That might be something you want to implement. And then again, which goes with it being fun, is when you train the way you like to train, there is an increase of adherence. You know, if you like training to failure and you intelligently implement it into your program, you're going to want to do your program more. And if you want to do your program more, it helps you stick to it. If you look forward to the gym because you're like, oh yeah, I get to train to failure a few sets today, this is going to be fun, then guess what? Sticking to your program is the best way to see results, sticking to your program. So again, if you do a program that you don't like, oh, I'm never training to failure, I feel like I'm always stopping a set before I really feel the burn, or, you know, I don't like training this way, and you just don't like doing that, then you're going to be a lot more likely to miss workouts or just not do them. Or it may like kind of backfire on you, and you may just say, fuck it, I'm going to train every single workout to failure. I don't like doing this anymore, and just kind of crack. And then again, that could lead to injury. So meet yourself in the middle with it. You know, if you're one of those people who just loves training to failure, because I know there are some of you out there who just do every set to failure, you listen to those people on YouTube who talk about doing every single set to failure, just intelligently implement it into your program so you kind of get the best of both worlds. Alright, then that was today's video. If you guys have any questions, comments, please leave them down below. Please like this video, share it with your friends. Someone you know likes training to failure, please show them this video. But I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.